I'm Katty in Washington. This is BBC World News America. Saying goodbye to George Floyd, the man who sparked protests around the world, is laid to rest in Houston amid calls for justice.
Until we know the price for black life is the same as the price for white life, we're going to keep coming back to these situations over and over again.
The funeral comes during a nationwide debate over the future of American policing, from changing the way it's done to defunding departments altogether. Getting things moving again. In Moscow, the Russian capital has loosened lockdown measures, even though thousands of new cases are being reported every single day. And travel. In the time of the coronavirus, our correspondent takes us along her journey through empty airports and strangely crowded plane cabins. Welcome to World News America on PBS and around the globe. A church in Houston today became the emotional focus of a movement that has ricocheted around the world. George Floyd died in a street in Minneapolis 2 weeks ago, but the brutal manner of his death has sparked protest as far away as Sydney, Australia. He was killed by a white policeman who kept his knee pressed on Mr. Floyd's neck so he couldn't breathe anymore. His funeral was an emotional appeal that should never happen again. The BBC's Barbara Plett-Usher has more.
After more than 2 weeks of protests, the man whose death energized a worldwide movement for racial justice was laid to rest in his hometown. It was a final goodbye for those who loved him most. In the midst of personal grief, friends and family have been thrust into a national convulsion, Americans forced into a passionate reckoning of historic wrongs.
I just want to say to him, I love you, and I thank God for giving me my own personal Superman.
No more hate crimes, please. Someone said make America great again, but when has America ever been great? Those 4 officers were literally on him for 9 minutes, and none of them showed they have a heart or soul. This is not just murder, but a hate crime.
I want justice for my brother, my big brother. That's Big Floyd. Everybody knows who Big Floyd is now.
Incredible things have happened since George Floyd's dying cries for breath, pinned to the ground by a policeman's knee. The guest list reflected the weight of the moment. Politicians, celebrities, civil rights leaders. Their presence a message that they'd heard the roar of voices raised in protest. The Democratic presidential nominee, Joe Biden, addressed Mr. Floyd's young daughter in a recorded video message.
No child should have to ask questions that too many black children have had to ask for generations. Why? Why's Daddy gone? And looking through your eyes, we should also be asking ourselves why the answer is so often too cruel and painful. Why in this nation do too many black Americans wake up knowing that they could lose their life in the course of just living their life?
Been a long time coming.
Punctuating the somber event, a display of joy and celebration. A homegoing celebration, they called it. George Floyd was remembered as a champion basketball and football player, a gentleman despite his imposing height at 6'6", a regular guy from a rough neighborhood. He may have been an unlikely catalyst for a pivotal moment in civil rights history, but his death brought out a veteran activist, Reverend William Lawson, who worked with Martin Luther King. This is a turning point, he said.
And back in the days when I used to be part of marches, all the marchers were black. But now, there are white people who know the story. And there are Hispanics who know the story. And there are Asians who know the story.
George Floyd will be buried next to his mother, for whom he cried out as he lay dying. But that's not the end of his story. When his life stretched out in front of him, he once told a friend, "I want to touch the world." And that he has done. Barbara Platt-Usher, BBC News, Houston.
For almost 3 hours in that church, they said goodbye. It was political, it was religious, there was a lot of singing, there were a lot of prayers, but it was also very personal. The story of George Floyd's life, remembered by his family as well. It was very touching. A frequent refrain at that funeral was that Mr. Floyd's death should not be in vain, and that means reforms for America's police and how to keep the country's cities safe. Joining me now to discuss that is Rayshawn Roy. He's a fellow at the Brookings Institute. Thank you very much for joining me, Mr. Ray. You have worked with police departments all around the country. Is there one reform above all others, do you think, that would make a difference?
Yes, I think there is. Well, first, thank you for having me on the show. The research that I've conducted, and I recently wrote a piece at the Brookings Institution, Bad Apples Come from Rotten Trees in Policing. I think one major reform that I highlight is restructuring civilian payouts for police misconduct. What happens in the United States is that when someone is killed by police, rarely are people brought to justice for that. So rarely is a police officer charged. Even more rarely is a police officer convicted, well less than 2% of the time. The other thing that happens is there is oftentimes a large civil payout. So for George Floyd's family, they will end up probably getting millions of dollars in a civil settlement. Those monies come from taxpayer dollars. What I'm asserting for is a shift away from taxpayer money to police department insurances. This becomes similar to the way that hospitals do it, the way that we do for malpractice insurance. This will allow for police chiefs to say that an officer is costing them more money and causing more harm, like we've seen with Officer Chauvin, who had nearly 20 police misconduct allegations.
So make officers pay both personally and make departments pay financially. One of the things that was said at the funeral today by the Reverend Al Sharpton, the eulogist, was that George Floyd could have been anybody, but that the reaction has not been anything. Do you think this moment is different? Do you think it is something new?
I think this moment is different. I think there is something about seeing a person take their last breath, yell out for their mama who died nearly 2 years before, underneath the knee of a police officer. Everyone's seen it on video. We also know that what happened to Christian Cooper in Central Park, New York City, with Amy Cooper, starts a continuum of police violence that runs down south through the death of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, and all the way to the death of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, up through Minneapolis, where we've seen George Floyd take his last breath. I think we're seeing a racial diversity when it comes to protesters that we haven't seen when it comes to the movement for Black lives. And I do think this moment is different. All 4 of the officers have been fired. All 4 of them have been charged. In Central Park, Amy Cooper lost her job. She lost her dog due to animal cruelty. The police chief in Louisville, Kentucky resigned. And in Georgia, 3 people have been charged for murder for killing Ahmaud Arbery. So I do think this moment is different, and I think we'll see change.
Mr. Ray, at the risk of revealing your age, you've written that you are 40 and that you've been pulled over by the cops in America more times than the number of years that you've passed on this earth. Do you hope that the next 40 years, do you think the next 40 years we're going to see fewer times that you get pulled over by the cops?
I mean, honestly, I surely hope so. You know, I think part of what happens in the United States is that blackness becomes weaponized. So even when Black people do not have a weapon, they are still susceptible to police violence. There's one statistic that highlights George Floyd's life, is that Black people are 3.5 times more likely to be killed by police when they're not attacking or have a weapon. And oftentimes we have to recognize that we cannot outclass racism. So it doesn't matter that I have a PhD. It doesn't matter that I'm a professor at a major university or work at one of the top think tanks in the world. None of those things sort of matter. All that matters is that people see Black skin. And that is something that needs to change. And that's what people are protesting for.
Ray, thank you very much for joining me. There was a sense of urgency at that funeral that this is a moment. Let's hope that Mr. Ray is right and that things can change. Tens of thousands of people, and this was also said, this is a global process. Tens of thousands of people have taken part in the UK in anti-racism protests, triggered, of course, by Mr. Floyd's death. On Sunday, angry demonstrators in the city of Bristol tore down a statue of the slave trader Edward Colston. Now attention has turned to other public statues, including one in the historic city of Oxford. It's from there that Rita Chakrabarti has this report.
Oxford, the latest flashpoint in a national clamour for change. This battle, though, has been going on for years. Cecil Rhodes, a 19th century imperialist, represents for these protesters the unacceptable face of British history, and they want his statue gone.
He's basically a crook, in my opinion, who went to other countries and exploited those countries for his own gain. He doesn't stand for my values, and I don't want to see him celebrated.
So I'm here with my little sister. We're from Botswana, our mum's from Botswana, and actually her father was made stateless by an apartheid government that was in part started and definitely helped to perpetuate by Cecil Rhodes.
I'm from Germany myself, I'm black, half white, and I know how important it is to look critically into the history, and there are certain parts of all cultures which are quite negative.
The killing of George Floyd has sparked protests across the world and across the UK. In Bristol this weekend, this ended with the controversial toppling of the statue of the slave trader Edward Colston. But should history be obliterated in this way? Scotland's first black professor says not.
I'm absolutely adamant that you start removing statues or street names to do with slavery. In 50 years' time, you'll forget the history of that slavery. And maybe some racists might be quite happy for you to take them down because you're taking down your history.
He backs the action in Edinburgh today to add a plaque to the Melville Monument, making clear the ties of Henry Dundas to the slave trade. Plymouth is doing the same with the statue of the slaver Sir Francis Drake. In Denbigh in Wales, there's pressure to take down Henry Stanley. And in London, the monument of the slaver Robert Milligan was removed, with a review of all the capital's statues and street names announced by the mayor.
They say that they want to erase a racist monument from the streets of Oxford. But even if others agree, and it's a big if, how does any of this help solve the deep inequalities that exist in the UK between black and white?
Well, it's huge symbolism, and I hope it's a catalyst for a conversation, a catalyst for policy change. That I want my child to go to school and to know the full story, uncomfortable truths about how this United Kingdom became great. It became great because it enslaved millions of people.
Silence for the minutes it took for George Floyd to die. The killing of a black man thousands of miles away has prompted a massive soul-searching here at home.
Rita Chakrabarti reporting there, and this is new, these protests around the world. We haven't seen this in previous killings here in the United States. Quick look at other news now from around the world. The World Health Organization has clarified comments on whether people who don't show COVID-19 symptoms can spread the disease. The group now says it's still a big unknown. On Monday, a WHO official said it was very rare for asymptomatic people to pass the disease on, but she's now stressed this observation was based on a relatively small set of studies. People were confused, I have to say. People queued for hours today to cast their votes in the US state of Georgia. Problems with voting machines caused the long lines and led to complaints that America's democratic process is flawed. Coronavirus measures, of course, also slowed down the process. In-person voting remains a tricky issue across the US following a controversial election in Wisconsin back in April. As of today, residents of Moscow can enjoy greater freedoms following a 2-month coronavirus lockdown there. People can move around the city freely, hair salons, other businesses, they're opening up again. But the virus is still a problem. Russia has the 3rd highest number of infections in the world, and Moscow is still reporting some 2,000 new cases every day. Sarah Rainsford has more.
After more than 10 long weeks of lockdown here in Moscow, suddenly it's all over. The Moscow mayor has declared that people are free to come out on the streets when they want, to go where they want, and to see who they want. After being extremely cautious During this lockdown, the mayor has declared a victory over coronavirus. Now, you still have to wear a mask when you're out on the streets, although most people don't really bother. And the general mood, talking to people here, is one of huge relief.
I think they should have done it ages ago. I'm very happy. The measures worked, but not totally. People were going outside anyway.
I'll put my mask on now. I have one I made myself. It's our first day outside today. I was in the metro and I was so happy to be back in society, to see people. It was so joyful.
But the risk hasn't gone away. In fact, in Moscow, there are up to 2,000 cases of coronavirus still being detected every single day. So the worry is for some that this is actually a decision motivated by politics rather than the pandemic. There's a Victory Day parade that's been rescheduled 2 weeks from now. And then after that, a key vote for President Putin, constitutional reforms that will allow him to stay in power for another 2 terms. So it seems the Kremlin may want a boost in the mood and in the economy ahead of those key dates.
Sarah Rainsford reporting same leaders juggling these same issues everywhere in the world. You're watching BBC World News America, and still to come on tonight's programme, winds of change in the energy industry. Why more companies are turning cold on coal and embracing renewable energy sources. North Korea has said it will cut all communication with South Korea, including the hotline between the two nations' leaders. The move appears to be in response to leaflets being flown over the border in balloons. The BBC's Laura Bicker has more.
Analysts believe that there could be more to this than just the anti-leafleting campaign. It could well be that Pyongyang is trying to escalate tensions, trying to create a crisis with South Korea in order to gain concessions, use the tension as leverage for future talks. It may also be due to the domestic situation in North Korea. Certainly Kim Jong-un has promised prosperity to his people, and so far that has yet to come. Also, we know that the COVID-19 situation, certainly there's speculation that there are a number of cases within the country. This could be a distraction domestically to try to get people to rally around what they have described as one enemy.
Coal is king, or so the saying goes, and as far back as the Industrial Revolution, that's pretty much been the case. But energy demand has been falling as we all stay home because of the COVID pandemic. And the energy industry has been laying waste to out-of-date power stations that burn coal. Instead, there's an increased push for renewable energy sources. Justin Roller has more.
Another coal-fired power station bites the dust. This one is in Australia a couple of weeks back, but it is part of a global trend. Why would you burn coal when you can get power from these? Just one rotation of this giant wind turbine can power the average home for a day. The race to build new renewables isn't just about the environment. It reflects a fundamental shift in the economics of energy.
In the early days, it was a more expensive way of producing power, but what we've seen with the rapid increase in scale, in technology and the scale of the wind farms and the operations, is that we've really been able to drive that cost curve much lower.
A decade ago, almost half of US electricity came from coal. This year, renewables are set to produce more power than the black stuff for the first time ever. And that is despite the American government's efforts to support the industry. That's because increasingly moving from coal to renewables isn't just about cutting CO2. It is also about making money.
Wind turbines, solar panels, the more you build, the cheaper they get. It's known as the learning curve. And once they're built, they're very cheap to run because their operating costs are essentially free. It's the sun and the wind. Whereas coal plants face dwindling resources, and that raises their operating costs.
And as supplies reduce over time, it's likely to get more expensive to dig the stuff out. In fact, investment in coal generation is only growing in places like China and other mostly developing nations, like here in India, where the government actively supports the industry. Does the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution point the way forward? Britain now has just 4 coal plants left. Its biggest, Drax in Yorkshire, will stop burning coal completely in March. These days, most of the electricity the plant produces comes from these compressed wood pellets imported from America. Now, because trees take up carbon dioxide when they grow, and because new trees are planted when the forests are harvested, it means Drax's net emissions have been reduced dramatically. Drax now wants to go a step further. It is working out how it can capture the carbon dioxide those wood pellets emit.
We'll stick that in a pipeline, which will take it out to the North Sea and stick it under the sea, and we'll bury it under the ground.
So you bury the CO2?
Absolutely. We'll stick the CO2 back underground where it belongs.
It would involve a truly massive investment, but would mean a power station that produces negative emissions, actually taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. The technology is still a long way off being deployed on this scale, but it does raise a glimmer of hope for the climate. Justin Rolat, BBC News, the north of England.
The clean skies, of course, have been one of the benefits of us all being in lockdown, and related to that is the fact that we haven't been flying anywhere. So when will we feel comfortable getting on a plane again? It's quite a personal question, but it comes, of course, with public health considerations. I'd like to go and visit my elderly parents who live in Cyprus, but is it okay? Is it even possible to fly there? My colleague Jean Mackenzie recently documented a journey that she took from Vienna back to London. Here's her story.
I've really found airports the most dystopian of all the places during COVID.
Access to Terminal 1.
It's like the airport is literally gathering dust.
For safety reasons, we kindly ask all passengers to keep at least 1 meter distance.
They keep playing these audio messages saying that you have to stay 1 metre away from all the other passengers. There are no other passengers. So we're at the wrong terminal. And that is not uncommon, to arrive at an airport and find out that the terminal that your ticket says your flight leaves from is in fact closed. So everything is shut, all the normal duty-free shops and the cafe completely closed up. They're places that you remember and you're used to being so busy. It just clashes completely with what your experience of something was before.
After each flight, the whole cabin is carefully disinfected.
Trains departing. Please hold on to the handrails.
This is one of the busiest airports in the world normally, and again it's just completely shut up.
Morning completed.
So every single seat on this flight is taken, we think. And so it's just impossible for people to keep their distance. You're in a confined space, sitting next to people for a long period of time. You can't move. We finally arrived in London. What just should be a couple of hours from Vienna has probably taken about 8. So we're at the end of a long journey.
Something that was once so normal now seems totally abnormal. It's hard to imagine doing it again. That was Jean Mackenzie reporting for us there. We would like to end this programme tonight with some of the music that rang out today at the funeral service for George Floyd back in Houston.
When you're lonely and your heart is filled with despair, remember God.
The service was seen as a homecoming for Mr. Floyd, and soulful sounds filled the Fountain of Praise Church throughout the service. Today capped 5 days of public mourning for the man whose death sparked an international movement against police brutality and racism more broadly. The memorials to Mr. George Floyd have come to an end, but the movement surely hasn't. I'll see you back here tomorrow.